you could have observed, I frantically typed into my computer while you were talking to catch up with these, very challenging presentations, very sophisticated presentations. So let me read what I have and test it out whether I covered at least a part of the thoughts that you presented me with. So dear friends and colleagues, let me first say that I'm overwhelmed by your friendliness, your generosity, and the scope of your intellectual and, I might add, also political engagement. I'm deeply moved by the interest and openness you have shown to my work, something I never expected, to be honest. But as I understand today's workshop, it is actually dedicated to collective spaces, the Minerva Center, the Cohn Center, and the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, where many of the ideas that we are discussing, but also the community of colleagues present here, have been shaped. That is, I think, what we are celebrating today. The agreements within this community are as important as its disagreements, and I wrote that sentence before I listened to Gideon's talk. But as you may realize, one needs a certain closeness and trust also to disagree. And therefore, I very much enjoyed that tensions and paradoxes and disagreements have been foregrounded in this symposium. Dialectics and belief dialectics can only be achieved by dialogue. And I have learned a lot from the dialogue with you and from this symposium, which has indeed taken up many of the intellectual traditions that go back to the time when Yehuda Elkanah was an influential teacher at this university and a mentor to many of us. For him, as for you and for myself, intellectual and political sensitivities were inseparable. For all of us, understanding knowledge means understanding knowledge in, of, and for society, as Reif formulated it so appropriately. The hope is that this understanding will benefit both our understanding and our shaping of this world. This is, of course, nothing else but the old Enlightenment hope that has come under severe criticism because of the repressive and colonialist qualities implicit in some forms of universalism. Reif has articulated a position which Yehuda would have expressed as rethinking, not unthinking, the Enlightenment, by stressing, for instance, the importance of responsibility. Is science all the way down political, or would that take away the autonomy of science? This was Reif's central question, to which I believe we give similar answers. It is, in short, a matter of shaping an appropriate economy of knowledge. An important aspect is, for him, following Hannah Arendt, limiting knowledge to make room for thinking. Only such a third space in which reflection always remains in flux can avoid two dangers: science as a machine of positivism, and the other danger, science taking the role of an overarching ideology. Let me take on another aspect of the Enlightenment discourse, or rather critique, that is the position that only the local is authentic, and that identity, epistemology, and politics are the only remedies against false claims of universality but I think that these have become equally dangerous for human solidarity, because human solidarity as a basis for collective action is not just a nice to have, but an essential presupposition for reacting to the global crisis circumscribed by the concept of the Anthropocene, as Ariel has so clearly explained to us. The term Anthropocene designates a comprehensive crisis of which climate change, biodiversity loss, environmental destructions are a part, and it has emerged in the geosciences, but has now also been taken up and much discussed in the humanities as well, as Yuval has stressed among others. One of the challenges inherent in the concept of the Anthropocene is the very notion of knowledge, because the Anthropocene clearly demands for new forms of knowledge, overcoming disciplinary trenches and requiring a systemic understanding of the coupled human-Earth system. Here, Reif's emphasis of synthesis comes in, but now as a demand for the reorganization of science, overcoming a dangerous ignorance, to take up Carmen's concept, inherent in the present disciplinary system. And I might add, and I go to it in a little while, even if I didn't always use the term ignorance, the book is meant as a forceful criticism of the disciplinary organization of science and its inadequacy as a response to the challenges of the Anthropocene, demanding not just new scientific knowledge, but broader forms of shared knowledge. Shared knowledge is one of the important concepts also that we have developed and used at the Institute. A new knowledge economy and knowledge coupled to new kinds of activism. So synthesis, again, Carmen, as a partial response to you, as you talked late in the day, it was kind of hard to cope up with your very dense and important presentation. Synthesis is certainly not meant as a matter of teleological tendency in the Hegelian sense, but overcoming some of the trenches of the borderlines between the sciences. Borderline is another important concept in the epistemology that I have described. It has become a matter of human survival. On this point, the Hegelian point, and Carmen mentioned the sequence of biological, cultural, and epistemic evolution as a main kind of indicator, and it relates interestingly, of course, to Gideon's memory of the beginning of our collaboration. So the sequence of biological, cultural, and epistemic evolution, I agree it does sound very Hegelian, so there's no question about that. But what it really tries to describe is a much more refined causal sequence. So, because each of these steps turns accidental consequences from one period into conditions for the next step that then become a necessity for the pursuit of the next step in this cascade of evolutionary process. Let me illustrate this. Niche construction, which has become a very important concept also in ecology. Niche construction means the capacity of certain species to shape their environment, and by shaping their environment, shape their own evolution. So it's kind of a feedback loop. So many species can do that, from termites via beavers to humans. But in humans, niche construction has become, has assumed the form of a new evolutionary process which we call cultural evolution. Niche construction is clearly an accident of biological evolution. Of all the species do it, some do it, some do not. And for a long time, in what is called anthropogenesis, the long transition period from, thank you very much, in the long transition period from early forms of hominids to fully developed humans, niche construction, cultural evolution has become ever more important, to the extent that the survival of the human species has become dependent on it. If we were all of a sudden without our technologies, without the agricultural revolution, we could not survive. So it has turned into a necessary condition. And my claim is that the same has happened to the role of science. Most of what the book describes in terms of the historical development of science is when science became, and Gideon has described this very well, an accidental feature, kind of a side effect of the exploration of tools of human work and of planning work in particular. And only very late in the history it has become an element of economic production. And now in the Anthropocene, and that is the claim, it has become an element without which we could not survive the conditions we have created, also with the help of science, the crises I have described before. But that is again not an automatism. And I say at many places in the book that we have no guarantee that the knowledge that science has produced and the knowledge that has brought us into this situation will be sufficient in order to survive or to cope in this situation. So this is, again, the notion of responsibility comes in. Science in its evolution now in the last 2-3 centuries in close entrenchment with capitalist development is something that has shown a high path dependency. And I emphasize this path dependence. It has been shaped by industrial developments, by who is in power, by who needed scientific knowledge and had the means to produce it. That is not clear that that kind of knowledge will also be capable of helping us to survive the conditions we have created. So that's really an open question. There's nothing predetermined. By the way, there is another aspect of ignorance that, again, doesn't figure in the search, because what I call it dark knowledge. And dark knowledge is the kind of knowledge that is in principle there. It's in the drawers, so to say. It's sometimes suppressed. It's sometimes not brought to the attention of the public or the politicians. It is knowledge that could be produced because we have the means to produce it, but that is actually not shared in the way so as to become productive. And there are many examples. Naomi Oreskes has shown this for prominent cases of cancer research, of the case of the ozone hole. There are some cases on which I report in which such knowledge was in principle there or on the verge of being created, but hasn't been used appropriately, or one had to fight for it. So my notion of ignorance is very strongly related to the need to fight for the production, and not only production, because that's the other side of the economy of knowledge, for the sharing, the appropriation, and the implementation of the knowledge that we need in order to cope with our situation. So, I think this is the moment where I should also comment on the myth. Myth actually plays an important role. As Gideon has reported about our common student taste, I want to mention another of my mentors who is mentioned frequently in the book, but he's not known really outside of Germany. This is Klaus Heinrich. He's a philosopher of religion, strongly influenced by Paul Tillich, Protestant theologian, and by, of course, Sigmund Freud, the Frankfurt School. And as I mentioned to you to some of you in private, he used the concept of foam much earlier than Sloterdijk, who has now become famous for it, apparently. But what I learned certainly from Klaus Heinrich is to take seriously mythological knowledge, religious knowledge, as a form of human self-reflection. In the last chapter of the book, if you want to read it, I use religion as a standard for what science could and perhaps should do without falling into your other trap, to become ideology, but as a form of self-reflection. And religion and myth have achieved this. I heard wonderful lectures of Klaus Heinrich, for instance, on Ovid's Metamorphosis, where he says that has been in a poetic form an anticipation of Freud's psychoanalysis, but it has the same kind of reflectivity on human emotions and embodiment, the two basic concepts that he uses. So I think this is very important to use myth and religion as as something that is not the other side in a positivistic sense of science, but that is part of human knowledge, a storage of important experiences of human history, and to some extent, and that's sort of the somewhat, I would say, audacious point that I try to make, is a standard for shared knowledge about this world. And we do need shared knowledge, as I emphasized already, as a basis for a collective action in view of the challenges of the Anthropocene. So, I'm extremely grateful to Gideon for recalling the origins of our collaboration, and I had little time, Gideon, to take notes, as I was frantically busy to, digest the other talks. But I do want to make two discussions. Of course, I agree. I do remember our discussions, and I just would like to make two remarks on it, because you also mentioned the institute, my role at the institute, and so on and so forth. one thing is, in such an institute, and you know it here from the Cohn Institute and the Minerva as well, it's not just a matter of education and jobs and careers. It has a deep intellectual meaning. It has a community shaping meaning, as I already emphasized, but, and this has again to do with counting the notion of ignorance, certain things you can only do with the appropriate institutional conditions. So when Gideon, Peter Damo and others started to write these books, we were kind of still, free-floating entities. We didn't have an institute as a support. What the institute made possible, Gideon, is to elaborate some of these ideas in depth. For instance, we worked on a specific, and with Rivka as well, on Galileo, a specific tiny period of the history of mechanics. But what we could then do in more than 2 decades with an entire group of scholars is really unfold this thinking, go through almost the entire history of mechanical thinking, look into other cultures. By the way, other cultures look into, what kind of knowledge was created in China and why it was forgotten, a very important episode here, and get a feel for long-term history. And that's very hard under the professional conditions of the humanities to go much, beyond, your case study. Case studies, we kind of saw it critically 20 years ago, but it's still a very prominent form of knowledge production. And we thought at the time, and the Institute gave us the possibility to implement it, was not a sufficient basis for understanding developments that typically take, some decades, some 100 years, some millennia sometimes, And I also, I disagree with you about, what one can learn about the history of mathematics. It's not just, Piaget hasn't been useful just for, the first step. He has been, and his work has been useful for, these long-term considerations as well. This brings me to the topic of cognitive science, Piaget, mental models that you also mentioned. And this is another thing that is very important to me, and it is, I think, very pertinent to our current discussion. So, theory, and we discussed it with Ariel earlier today, historians of science, historians of ideas, make use of all kinds of notions that ultimately are notions about cognition, about human cognition. But they too rarely, I still think, make contact with other forms of studying human cognition. In cognitive science, for instance, this was a reference point for us at the time. It was not just Piaget, it was Marvin Minsky, it were many others that inspired us, and I want to be very precise here, that inspired us to give a much more differentiated description of intellectual exchange and intellectual development than you can achieve with notions such as influencing, reading a book, drawing consequences, the kind of, descriptive language that we use in the humanities to describe the exchange of ideas. Now, this is not a toolbox that you can simply bring in from a foreign science, psychology, cognitive science, into history without adapting the tools to the work at hand. So what we have done in Berlin is not just taking over Piaget, as he did it himself in his book with Garcia that you mentioned, but adapting some of these concepts to the task at hand, namely to the historical and cultural development of knowledge, mainly in order to achieve a precision that otherwise cannot be achieved. And the same goes, of course, for the mental models. And it has allowed us, and again, this refers to the first point I made, it has allowed us to deal with much broader text materials in different languages over long terms. This is also something that's not just a matter of perspective, it's a matter of material. How many texts can you work on? How many concepts can you compare? And we have actually intensely used, and that hasn't been mentioned today, intensely used the tools of the digital humanities in order to get a stronger empirical grounding of some of these. So it's interdisciplinary, taking into account methodologies that help us to describe cognition in a more precise, in a more thorough sense, but also taking into account text and images. Recently, images have become more important in order to create a to create an empirical grounding for that. And now, and this will be my last remark on the Institute, we are now start in my last years at the Institute, we are starting to develop, and what we have done we call a historical epistemology, in the sense of an epistemology that is grounded in historical empirical material, a historical epistemology of computer models, of brain research, of thinking, in order to bring in these more recent ideas, and of course also stimulated by the work of Arnold Utfreund, who has been a pioneer in this field, and Ariel, and this will be a center of our next years. And it's again also with the intention to bring together humanists and natural scientists on a theme that is relevant to both fraction. And it is a theme that is of course very relevant to understanding the Anthropocene, because how do we know we are in the Anthropocene? It's because of global data and of modeling global data. So modeling is a key lens through which we look at our reality. So understanding the epistemology of modeling is something that seems relevant. So finally, Rivka, you have put me to shame with your kind words, I have to say. But I can see that they are testimony less to any merits that I might have, but rather to a very long friendship with you and many others who are here. And I have mentioned part of them already. I mean, I could mention so many people, from Leo to Shaul and Gabi, of course, with whom I had many discussions on all of these issues. So I can live with praise only because it effectively addresses our community and its values. So I can share that praise with all of you. And this also goes for the book, which is very much a joint achievement. And as you can learn from Gideon's story of the preface, so that's again the dialectics here. It's sometimes good if one person writes a book, because otherwise it never gets written. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it is a joint achievement. So, from Rivka I have learned about the complexities of the interaction between science and religion. So religion has been an ongoing concern, and that understanding has deeply shaped our work on pre-classical mechanics, and the work that we did together with Gideon and other colleagues on pre-classical mechanics, that's a term that came up in this context, has shaped my thinking also about evolution, transformation of knowledge. That's really common work. So, I have to come to a close. It is quite moving for me to see you all here assembled, among them some of my closest friends for many years. And my intellectual and personal life would be unthinkable without you. And surely also without Yehuda Elkanah, whose image we saw in the other room. Not only a mentor and a friend, but somebody who nourished this larger intellectual family of which we are all part. And let me add one more word. In a difficult moment of transition in my life, Israel, Tel Aviv University and the Cohn Institute became a rescue for me and my family, and we will always be grateful for that. Thank you very much.